Today we're diving into Sleeping Dogs 2024, a mind-bending psychological thriller that unravels dark secrets buried for over a decade. A detective with shattered memories, a murder wrapped in mystery, and a truth more devastating than imagined. We begin with Roy Freeman, a man whose house is covered in notes, reminders stuck everywhere to help him remember basic things. His name, where the kitchen is, when to take his medicine, and more. Once a police officer, Roy suffered a car accident 10 years ago that wiped out his memories. He's now undergoing an experimental medical treatment under the supervision of a female doctor, although the procedure offers no guaranteed results. One day, Roy unexpectedly receives a call from a woman named Emily. She's a lawyer representing a prisoner and wants to speak to Roy about a case from the past. Curious, Roy visits her at a restaurant where they meet in person. Emily shows him a photo of Isaac Samuel, a man convicted of murder a decade ago and now scheduled to be executed next month. Emily explains that Isaac had specifically asked to speak to Roy and his former partner, the detectives who interrogated him on the night of the murder. Roy, however, doesn't recognize the man in the photo and insists he has no connection to him. Later, back at home, Roy begins to dig through his old files. Among the records, he finds the victim's photo and Isaac Samuel's arrest documents. The sight of them triggers vague, fragmented memories in Roy's mind. The next day, he visits Isaac in prison. Isaac pleads his innocence and says he's been imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. He admits he did go to the victim, Vider's house, intending to kill him, but someone else had already murdered Vider before he arrived. He was too intoxicated that night to recall the details clearly and ended up confessing to a crime he didn't commit. Roy questions why Isaac went to Vider's house in the first place. Isaac explains that a year before Vider's death, he had been caught stealing and Vider had testified against him in court. That ruined his life and he sought revenge. Still, Roy remains skeptical. Isaac then urges him to speak to Richard Finn, a man who was writing a book about the murder case. Returning home, Roy takes his prescribed medication. His doctor had advised him to keep his brain active as part of the treatment, so he spends time solving puzzles. While going through the old case files, he notices the signature of Officer Jimmy Rems, the man who recorded statements from both Richard Finn and Isaac Samuel. The following day, Roy visits Jimmy. The moment Jimmy sees Roy, he's stunned and quickly invites him inside. It turns out the two were once partners in the police department and close friends, meeting again after 10 years. But for Roy, Jimmy is a stranger. His past is still a blank slate. During their conversation, Roy tries to recall an incident from duty, but then has to admit he's suffering from Alzheimer's and doesn't remember anything. Roy tells Jimmy that he doesn't remember much, but he's come for help. He reminds Jimmy about Isaac Samuel, the man they arrested 10 years ago. Roy admits he visited Isaac in prison, and though Isaac had confessed, he now claims he's innocent. Roy is beginning to believe him. Isaac also mentions someone named Richard Finn, and when Roy revisited the case file, he found Finn's fingerprints all over the crime scene. Oddly, Finn had claimed in his statement that he wasn't even home the night of the murder, but no one had ever questioned that contradiction. Roy proposes that they both meet with Finn and hear what he has to say. However, Jimmy dismisses the idea and tells Roy to go home and rest, promising he'll call once he meets Finn himself. Back at home, Roy sifts through some old belongings and stumbles upon a broken photo frame. Before he can examine it closely, his phone rings. It's Jimmy. He breaks the news that Richard Finn has been found dead, an apparent drug overdose. But something about it doesn't sit right with Roy. The autopsy report shows only a single needle mark on Finn's arm, which raises suspicions because it suggests Finn wasn't a habitual drug user. Suddenly, a memory clicks. Roy recalls that Finn had also shown up at the original crime scene 10 years ago. Still, Jimmy insists that Isaac Samuel was the real killer. After all, He confessed to the murder. Wanting more answers, Roy visits Finn's funeral and speaks to his ex-wife and brother. They both confirm that Finn never used drugs. Then his brother gives Roy a book, something Finn had been working on, titled The Book of Mirrors. It was about the Veeder murder. Roy takes the book home and starts reading. The story jumps back 10 years, unfolding Finn's perspective. At a party hosted by Dr. Whiter, Richard Finn meets a woman named Laura. The two become close and soon move in together. Dr. Whiter, a college researcher, was Laura's supervisor. Finn, on the other hand, had always dreamed of being a writer, but after his father's death, his mother couldn't support him financially. Laura introduced him to Veeder, who then gave Finn a job in his private home library. Surrounded by books, Finn felt like he had finally found purpose. However, over time, Finn begins to grow suspicious of Laura. One day he discovers that she is having a physical relationship with Dr. Whiter. The betrayal stings deeply. Later, Finn finds Weeder's manuscript and learns that the doctor had been conducting psychological research, possibly using people around him as subjects, including Finn. To his shock, Finn sees Laura's name added to the manuscript, as if she's trying to claim co-authorship. When Finn confronts Whiter, the doctor warns him to stay away from Laura and says he's leaving town for a while to deal with matters related to the book. He expects Finn to have sorted things out by the time he returns. That evening, Finn comes home to find Laura gone. The next day, news breaks that Dr. Whiter has been murdered and the killer has already been caught. At the crime scene, we see detectives Roy and Jimmy in action, but Laura vanishes after the murder. Later, it's revealed that she tried to claim ownership of Veeder's research, but the Department of Defense rejected her claim. Back in the present, Roy continues reading the manuscript, and his suspicions turn toward Laura. He meets Jimmy at a bar and expresses his belief that Laura may have played a bigger role in the murder than anyone thought. But Jimmy shrugs it off, insisting there's no point in digging up old graves. What's done is done. Still, Roy isn't ready to give up. He tells Jimmy that he had spoken to Finn's ex-wife and believes she might know where Laura is. At that moment, Roy thinks he spots Laura in the bar, but it turns out to be a hallucination. Later, Roy visits his doctor. She explains that. The doctor explains to Roy that experiencing hallucinations during his treatment is not uncommon, especially given the nature of the experimental procedure he's undergoing. The next day, Roy visits Richard Finn's widow at her home. She tells him that one day she overheard Finn on the phone, and he sounded furious. Curious, she later checked the number. It belonged to someone named Elizabeth. She suspects this woman may have had something to do with Finn's death. Roy begins investigating and is shocked to discover that Elizabeth is Laura, who had changed her identity and was now living in the city under a new name. Determined to confront her, Roy tracks down her address. When he finally meets her face-to-face, she recognizes him instantly. Roy is surprised and asks how she knows him. Laura replies that they met long ago at a restaurant. Roy hands her Finn's manuscript and informs her that Richard has been murdered. Laura pretends not to know anything. Roy presses further, telling her that the manuscript is about the murder of Dr. Whiter, and that Finn suspected she might have orchestrated it. He urges her to read the manuscript and consider what it reveals. Roy continues his investigation by meeting with Dr. Whiter's former caretaker, Debo. During the conversation, Roy learns that Whiter was heavily involved with many women, often inviting them to his home. One of them was a bartender named Diane Lynch. It turns out Whiter kept detailed records on all the women he associated with and stored them at a location on Devonshire Street. Later that evening, as Roy is sorting through some old documents at home, the doorbell rings. It's Laura. She has returned with the manuscript. Outside, however, Roy's former partner Jimmy is watching the house, secretly keeping tabs on Roy's movements. Inside, Roy asks Laura what she thinks about the manuscript. She dismisses it as complete nonsense, claiming Finn was fabricating stories from his imagination. According to her, They were never even lovers. Then Roy mentions the name Susan Avery, and Laura visibly flinches. As she leaves, she cryptically tells him, "You used to enjoy drinking a lot." Her comment unsettles Roy, triggering a faint, fragmented memory. After she leaves, Roy steps outside to grab a few things. But suddenly, a car speeds toward him in an attempt to run him down. In a moment of self-defense, Roy fires his weapon, killing the driver. When he approaches the car to identify the attacker, he is stunned. It's Davenport, Doctor, Wider's former caretaker. Since Roy had acted in self-defense, no charges were filed against him. Later, he and Jimmy meet at a bar, where Roy shares something troubling. He tells Jimmy that he went through all the case files from the past 30 years, every one of them signed by both of them. But when he reviewed Dr. Wider's file, it only had Jimmy's signature. That fact deeply unsettles Roy, and he asks Jimmy why that is. Feeling accused, Jimmy grows defensive and abruptly storms out. Roy regrets the confrontation, but, battling his demons, turns to alcohol again, despite strict warnings from his doctors to avoid drinking. As the alcohol clouds his mind, he begins experiencing intense hallucinations once more. Overwhelmed, he passes out. The next morning, Roy wakes up disoriented, lying by the side of the road. In his notebook, he finds the name Diane Lynch scribbled, a name he doesn't remember writing. Curious, he visits the bar where she used to work, only to learn that Diane died 5 years ago. Suddenly, his body begins reacting violently again, and he collapses from another wave of hallucinations. Sometime later, Roy tracks down Susan Avery, who once worked with Dr. Wider. She shows Roy a copy of Wider's original manuscript, but what shocks him is that Laura had stolen the material and published it under her name. This revelation sends Roy back to Wider's long-abandoned house to search for more clues. There, an old memory resurfaces, prompting him to dig in the garden. Beneath the soil, he uncovers a baseball bat still stained with dried blood. Before he can fully process what he's found, Laura arrives unexpectedly, and close behind her is Jimmy, who had been following them. Jimmy tells Roy to bury the bat back where he found it and pulls a gun on both of them, forcing them inside. With his weapon drawn, Jimmy confesses that everything he did was to protect Roy. He asks, "Don't you remember anything about Diane Lynch?" Tension spikes. Laura accuses Jimmy of blackmail, but Jimmy fires back, calling her a manipulative woman who used others to do her dirty work. He reveals that it was Laura who orchestrated Davenport's attack and even manipulated Finn. Suddenly, Laura turns the gun on Roy and coldly says, "Dying without memory. What a blessing that would be." But before she can pull the trigger, Jimmy, still alive and barely hanging on, shoots her, killing her instantly. Roy rushes to his friend's side as Jimmy lies dying. In his final moments, Jimmy whispers, "Everything I did for you," and takes his last breath. This leads into the film's final chapter. Roy, now fully lucid and recovered, meets with his doctor. This time he answers every question with clarity. His memory has completely returned. We learn that the man who was about to be executed for Wider's murder has now been released from prison, thanks to Roy's efforts. Roy was able to prove that it was Laura who orchestrated Dr. Wider's murder. Now, with the truth uncovered and justice finally served, Roy stands as a man who has reclaimed not just his memory but his purpose. As the final truths come to light, the story takes us one last time into the past. In this final flashback, we learn the most heartbreaking revelation. Diane Lynch, who once worked as a bartender, was Roy's wife. Diane had suffered greatly at the hands of her abusive, alcoholic father. Haunted by trauma, she sought help from Dr. Wider, a well-known psychologist. But instead of helping her, Wider took advantage of her vulnerability. Later, one evening at a bar, Laura approached Roy and revealed the dark secret about his wife. At first, Roy refused to believe her, but then Laura handed him a tape recording, a horrifying piece of evidence that captured Diane and Weeder together. When Diane learned that Roy had discovered the truth, she was overwhelmed with shame and despair. Not long after, she took her own life. Roy, devastated and furious, couldn't bear the betrayal. Blinded by rage, he went straight to Weeder's house and brutally beat him to death with a baseball bat. What he didn't know was that Samuel Isaac was also hiding inside the house that night. Isaac, who had his reasons for confronting Weeder, witnessed the aftermath. When Jimmy arrived and saw what Roy had done, he immediately took control of the situation to protect his friend. To save Roy, Jimmy framed Samuel Isaac for the murder, crafting a story that aligned perfectly with Isaac's known grudge against Weeder. As for the bloody bat, the murder weapon, Jimmy buried it in the garden, concealing the truth for years. And that is how the story of Sleeping Dogs ends. And that was the haunting story of Sleeping Dogs, a journey through memory, guilt, and justice. If this mystery had you hooked, drop a comment below and let us know your favorite twist. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another gripping recap.